Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Ayin Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Karen Bloom in honor of the 5th anniversary of Elisa Gabriela's bat mitzvah on Parshat Va'era. Your family is so proud of you and inspired by your commitment to learning the daf. We love you so very much. Nice to know young people learning the daf. To all you young people out there, we're very, very impressed and very proud. We're going to get started now with the top of our daf. Ganav v'tavach b'Yom Kippur. We have a very interesting daf that gets off on all sorts of interesting topics that come up in other places, and starting with minei minei, which is our main topic that we've been talking about in these Mishnayot, because again, as we talked about, our Mishnah sets up all these cases where you're not liable, the death penalty, and therefore not exempt from the monetary payment. Whereas the next Mishnah talks about all sorts of situations where at the same moment that you slaughtered it or did some action, you ended up also doing something that obligated you with the death penalty. Because you get the death penalty, you actually are exempt from the payment. And that's called minei, which means we give you the more severe punishment. Now, there's a big debate, and this comes up at the very beginning of today's daf. Is this only death and payment? What about lashes and payment? Lashes is also considered more severe because it's something to your body rather than just to your wallet. And therefore, what if you're liable lashes and payment? Does the lashes obligation come and override the payment? That's where we're going to start today. Ganav v'tavach b'Yom Kippurim. If you do it on Yom Kippur, what do we say? Why are you not liable the death penalty? Because you're liable the death penalty in the hands of God, not in the court. And if it's not in the court, then there is no minei. By the way, there's a sheet for today, so if you haven't seen it yet, you can use it to guide you through today's daf. So Amre Amai, they say, wait a minute, you forgot something though. Why? And that's when we said, okay, there's no death penalty, we got that, but there might not be a death penalty, but but there is lashes. And if there's lashes, means you get the more severe punishment, which means you shouldn't be liable the death penalty, you shouldn't be liable the payment because you're getting lashes. Okay, anything where we'll learn this when we get to Kritut, which is in a long time, but anytime you're liable the death penalty of karet, which is in the hands of God, we don't punish you in the court by death, but you do get lashes for it. So, and also some people say that's your atonement, perhaps that will atone for your karet. Anyway, we have a long time till we get there. And it's known de'eno lokel mishalem. And kimle applies by lashes as well. So how could we understand this Mishnah? Then you shouldn't have to pay arba v'chamisha on Yom Kippur. Amre, and this is going to set us up for almost the rest of today's daf. Haman ate Rabbi Meir. Our Mishnah must be Rabbi Meir. Why Rabbi Meir? Da'amal lokel mishalem. Because Rabbi Meir actually holds lokel mishalem. And according to our Gemara, it seems like he's the only one who holds that way. In other words, even though we think kimle b'derabba minei means take the most severe punishment, it's according to Rabbi Meir, it's only if it's death. Death penalty means you don't have to pay. But if you get lashes, you could get lashes and also have to pay. You can incur a punishment of lashes and payment all at the same time. So that must be Rabbi Meir. So we basically have to say that our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. Now the Gemara says, wait. Now, we don't really know at this point, or the Gemara maybe does know, but kind of suggests maybe we don't know. What Rabbi Meir, does Rabbi Meir, if he holds lokel mishalem, does it mean he doesn't have kimle at all? Does it mean that he thinks meit u'mishalem? Now, if we say that he thinks meit u'mishalem, what's the problem? The problem is that our Mishnah is a unit with the next Mishnah. Our Mishnah sets up all the cases where there isn't kimle. And the next Mishnah sets up all the cases where there is kimle b'derabba minei. So the Gemara says, I Rabbi Meir. If we think it's Rabbi Meir, then afilu tabach b'Shabbat. If he doesn't hold lokel, if he thinks lokel u'mishalem, meaning I don't hold kimle by lashes, perhaps he doesn't hold kimle at all. Now, meaning if there's death, right, even tabach b'Shabbat, you should be liable to pay arba v'chamisha, and that's not what appears in our next Mishnah. And if you want to say, which was the obvious, that no. He thinks that when it's lashes, you would get lashes and have to pay. But when it's death, and it's much more severe, then there is a din of kimle, meaning he doesn't disagree entirely with kimle. He just limits it to death cases, death penalty, but not lashes. But this is introduced with a chitema. Chitema we're going to reject. Now, I'll already tell you that eventually this is going to be the answer. But right now, they're going to reject it temporarily and say, in the end, the answer is that Rabbi Meir really holds kimle by death, not by lashes. That's his opinion. But the Gemara right now is suggesting that based on another source of Rabbi Meir, it doesn't seem to be that that's the case. Vilo, does he think that there's a din of kimle by death? Can't be, because look at the following source. And this is the braita that we're going to deal with for the bulk of today's stuff. Ganav, and I actually charted it out just so you can see it as a chart on the second side of the study guide. Why I put it there? Because it's going to be more dealt with over there, the different details. Okay, but if you look at the very top of the second side of the study guide, you'll see on the second sheet. Ganav, we're going to have three cases. Ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat, okay, where normally we would say kimle b'derabba minei, because you're over malacha on Shabbat by slaughtering, and right at the same moment you both slaughtered and did the tvicha, you should be exempt according to laws of kimle. And what are we going to see? I'll already tell you that Rabbi Meir says you're liable, and that's going to mean that it looks like anyway. At this point, it looks like Rabbi Meir actually thinks not only lo ke u'mishalem, meaning not only is there no law of kimle in lashes, but also meit u'mishalem. You could, at the same moment, get the death penalty and have to pay, because he says exactly this. Ganav v'tabach b'Shabbat, and in a minute we'll see, Rabbi Meir is mechayev. You have to pay 4 Let's just look at the three cases before we didn't say yet what the law is. If you did ganav and then slaughtered on Shabbat, ganav v'tavach l'avodah zarah, you stole it and slaughtered it for the purposes of idol worship, or also you'd be theoretically liable the death penalty, and ganav v'tavach shor haniskal u'tvacho. Okay, we don't yet understand Rabbi Meir in all these cases. We'll get back to them later. But if you took a shor haniskal, remember what that is? Your shor gored another person, killed the person, and then, right, they testify against the shor gets judged, and once the shor is judged, they're called a shor haniskal, which means they need to get stoned while they're still alive. You cannot benefit from that animal at all. Okay, there's forbidden to benefit from. So if you stole a shor haniskal and slaughtered it, mishalem 4 Okay, again, we're not going to deal with these cases right now. We will get back to them. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Chachamim putlim, the rabbis exempt. Now, the simple understanding of just case number one, because that's all we're dealing with right now, which is why I didn't bring this whole braita on the chart, chart out later when we dealt with each case. But right now, we're dealing with ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat. So very simply, this machloket looks like the rabbis say you're exempt because of the laws of kimle b'derabba minei. You're liable the death penalty for doing a malacha on Shabbat, and therefore exempt from paying. Versus the other side, which is Rabbi Meir, who says you're liable to pay 4 Why are you liable to pay? Because meit u'mishalem, just like lo ke u'mishalem. So now we have a problem, because first of all, Rabbi Meir, if we say Rabbi Meir, the first Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, obviously then the continuation of the Mishnah, which is the next Mishnah, is Rabbi Meir. And that says, Ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat, you're exempt because of the laws of kimle. And so, number one, you can't say this Mishnah is Rabbi Meir if the next Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Meir. And number two, you would also have a contradiction between Rabbi Meir and the braita, Rabbi Meir and the Mishnah, because they're both talking about the exact same case. One says patur, one says chayav. So basically, if we're going to assume, which we did assume, and we will eventually assume, as this will stay, that our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, because otherwise, how do you explain Yom Kippur? Because everyone else would say, you're not lokel mishalem, law of kimle applies, and you wouldn't pay either there. Then, if that's Rabbi Meir, the rest doesn't sound like Rabbi Meir, and it doesn't sound like, right, it seems to be that Rabbi Meir does think you could both incur the death penalty and pay from this braita. So what we're obviously going to have to do is explain the braita in a different way, which gets us to another very interesting halacha. Amrei bar minei dahahi. So the Gemara says, no. Ignore this braita. This braita doesn't have to do, it's not what you thought it is, and we do what we call as an ukimta. An ukimta means we're going to say the Mishnah was talking about only in a particular case of ganav v'tabach on Shabbat are you going to be liable. What is that? Well, instead of, now normally in ukimtas we're stuck, we have a problem, we're going to explain something in a different way. But now the Gemara is going to say the following. Daha itmar la. It was already said about this Mishnah. In other words, we're not making this up right now because we're stuck. But it was already said. Someone else already explained this Mishnah. Who explained it? Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, now this is important to see how this all went. Either Rabbi Yaakov said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, or Amrila, some people say Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, or Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of Rish Lakish. Rabbi Avin v'Rabbi Ilah b'chol chavruta mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan Amre. Okay, and they said the following: Rabbi Avin, Rabbi Ilah, and the whole chabur, everybody. You could see this was a big issue. Got together and said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, b'tover al yedei achim. Okay, so we had this whole group of rabbis coming together to discuss this braita that didn't make any sense, and they said, this braita is when. Okay, let's go to our case. We have Ruth steals from Naomi and hires Yael to slaughter the animal for her, or asks Yael to slaughter the animal for her. So Ruth did the stealing, Yael did the slaughtering, and then how does this resolve our issue? When does that apply? When at the same moment you incur the death penalty and a payment. But what happened here? Yael slaughtered it on Shabbat. Yael has to pay the death, has to get the death penalty. Ruth is liable for tvicha u'mechira, though. Ruth incurs the monetary payment of the arba v'chamisha payment. Now, okay, this is a confusing thing, though, because what do we know? There's something called, okay, let's start with why did Yael get the death penalty? Ruth asked her to do it. Okay, so you could have two reasons. Number one, maybe Ruth didn't say slaughter it on Shabbat. Okay, that's the easiest answer. But we also know that there's a law of ein shaliach lidvar avera, which means what? There is no such thing as sending someone to do a sin. If Ruth hires Yael to slaughter her animal on Shabbat, let's say Ruth said, slaughter it right now, and it was Shabbat, and Yael does it, Yael's going to get the death penalty and not Ruth, because Yael has her own mind, and she should know that it's forbidden to do this on Shabbat. And okay, but what happens here, though? Wait a minute. But also the tficha then. In other words, what's happening? There's a payment of arba v'chamisha because Ruth stole the animal. Now, this is complicated because Ruth stole the animal and had Yael slaughter it. Now, first of all, Yael might not even know it was stolen. Right? Ruth didn't necessarily tell her it was stolen. So it's hard to bring in shliach lidvar avera here. It's very confusing. And what seems clear to the Gemara is we're going to say yesh shliach lidvar avera, meaning Ruth, when you say, again, it's a bit of a confusing language. There is a shaliach b'dvar avera. That means there is such a concept of agency when it comes to a sin, meaning agency means shlucho shel adam k'moto. That person operates as you. So if you hire someone to slaughter an animal that you stole, the monetary obligation is on you, not on the shaliach. And that's what we're going to discuss right now. So the Gemara says exactly what you're expecting. If, okay, so basically, just to be very clear here, before we move on to the whole shliach lidvar avera, which is Ruth is going to have to pay because she doesn't incur the death penalty. The reason why, and as Rabbi Meir, this goes back to answer our question. Rabbi Meir in general holds, if it's lashes, you will have to get lashes and pay all at the same time. But if it's death, you're actually exempt. So why does he obligate in that case? Because that case was a case where Ruth didn't get the death penalty. Yael got the death penalty and Ruth got the monetary payment. Okay, now this issue is what we're going to struggle with right now. In other words, again, Ruth didn't do the slaughtering. We never make you obligate for something you didn't do. If you sent a messenger, they did it, not you. So how could we make Ruth liable to pay when Yael did the slaughtering? Amar Rava shane hachad amar kra. Here it's unique because the pasuk says utvacho o mecharo. Again, every time they say umecharo, it should be o mecharo. You either slaughter it or you sell it. Those are the two possibilities of what you would do to incur the 4 or 5 payment. Now, ma mechira al yedei achel. How do you sell something? Well, you need another person to be able to sell. If you don't have a second person, you can't sell it. So theoretically, you see that there's agency there and still you're obligated. We don't make the person who bought it obligated. You who sold it to them is obligated, even though you didn't do, now here you did some sort of action, but without another person, you wouldn't have been able to do it. So af tvicha yedei acher. So if here you couldn't have slaughtered it without hiring someone else to do it, right? Or you just happened to ask someone to slaughter it, also you'd be liable. Okay, that's Rava, that's where he learns it from. So what basically we're going to see is that this is an exception to the rule. Tficha u'mechira is going to be a case where even if you hire an agent to do it, you are obligated and not the messenger. And here are 2 more braitot that prove it from the psukim, the same halacha. Rabbi Yishmael Tana o l'rabot et hashaliach. It says tfacho o mecharo or that or word, it could have just said tfacho umacharo, and it would have basically meant the same thing, even though it usually means and, but still they're saying that extra word, even though it's not necessarily extra, is the rabot that hashaliach comes to include even a messenger. Debate again, meaning you're going to be obligated even if you appointed someone else to do that part for you. When it says you have to pay 5 bakar tachat ashur and 5 tzon tachat aseh, tachat in place of, they say here, that means also if someone does it in place of you, it's as if you did it. Okay, again, this is definitely taking the word out of context, but it's a word that theoretically is not so necessary. Definitely 2 mentions of it are not necessary. And from here, they say it's to include a shaliach, that again, this is an exception to the whole rule of yesh shaliach lidvar, of ein shaliach lidvar avera. In this case, there is agency to do a sin, where in the end, the person who sent the agent is going to be liable. Amalei Rav Ashi. Hatam lav mishum. Okay, so now here's our question, right? So he says, 1 second, did I skip something? Oh, sorry, I skipped something. Matkif lamar zutra. So Rav Zutra now questions this and says, wait a minute. And this is a fascinating question. He says, Mi ikamidi di'ilu avid ihu lo mechayev ve'avid shaliach u'mechayev. But we have a very strange thing here. If Ruth slaughters the animal herself, she is going to be exempt from payment. But if she hires someone to do it, she's going to be obligated in payment. In other words, how could a shaliach make it actually worse than if she did it? We understand shlucho shel adam kamoto. An agent is basically like you, unless they're doing an avera, and then we basically say different. Now, this is an exception. We're going to make them like you. But if you did it yourself, you would be exempt because of kim minei. Now that you hired an agent to do it, they're going to actually obligate you on something that if you yourself did, you'd be exempt. So that sounds counterintuitive. To which Amalei Rav Ashi, and this is really at least his conceptual way of conceptualizing the concept of kim minei. How does it work? Does it mean, now I'll say it outside before we read it inside. When kim minei says we're not going to obligate Ruth both the death penalty and payment, is it that the death penalty comes and basically wipes out any sort of payment obligation, saying, well, you did something so severe, it's as if you didn't do what obligates you the payment and erases it entirely? Or is it there and just, let's say, covered up, right? In other words, the obligation of the death, which is so severe, says to us, listen, we're going to not make you obligated, even though you really are obligated, but we're not going to technically act on it. You have an obligation to pay, but we're going to not bother you about it. We're not going to make you do it because you have this other punishment on your head. So comes Rav Ashi and he says, Hatam la mishum de lo mechayevu. It's not that Ruth isn't liable to pay. She is liable to pay. It's just that ela dekim lebedirabe minei. Okay, it's just that because she also gets the death penalty, we're not going to obligate her to pay. Basically, he's taking the second option that I said. It's not that there is no obligation. In other words, if you could have seen it as, okay, you have a death penalty on your head and you have a monetary obligation, we're basically going to say it's as if you have no monetary obligation. And then our question would kick in about how could we make Ruth liable for more if someone else did something that she herself wouldn't have been obligated. But if we just say that the payment obligation is there, it's just as covered up or pushed aside because of the death penalty. Well, if there is no death penalty, then it's not pushed aside and the payment is there in existence. It's like we had, remember, Tumah Hutra B'tzibor, that if all the tzibor is tameh, you can do a sacrifice. And we talked about, is it dehuya or is it hutra? Is it permitted entirely and it's as if you're not tameh at all? Or is it just pushed aside, which means the tumah is there, it's just we're going to let you do it anyway. And it's the same kind of conceptual framework here. Is the payment there or is it entirely permitted, right? It's as if you didn't do anything wrong. So Rav Ashi obviously explains here, no, you still did something that obligates you with payment. It's just we can't make you pay it. But in a case where we could make you pay it because you don't have the death penalty, so of course it's still there. And that's how he resolves that question. Now we have a bigger problem. So what did we do here? We started, let's just review. We started with Rabbi Meir. We said our Mishna must be Rabbi Meir because we had this problem of Loke and Mishalim. How could you have that? Okay, Mishnah's Rabbi Meir. If the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, what about the rest, the next part of the Mishnah? Mate and Mishalem? Doesn't Rabbi Meir hold mate and Mishalem? And we said, no. Rabbi Meir doesn't hold mate and Mishalem. Now, you might have thought from this braita that he does, that you'd have to pay also you get the death penalty and also pay, because in the case of ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat, he says chayav, to which we said, no, that's a case of toveach al yedei acher. He doesn't think mate u mishalem. No, kimle b'dirabah minei applies in death. It doesn't apply with lashes. And that braita is somebody else slaughtered. Okay, that's very nice, and explain the first line of the braita of tavach u'machal ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat, Rabbi Meir mechayev. But the rabbis exempt you. Now, the Gemara asks, if Ruth stole and then gave it to Yael to slaughter, and Yael does the slaughtering and incurs the death penalty, and Ruth has the monetary payment, she should have to pay. So why would the rabbis exempt in this case, right? So basically, we're questioning the ukimta we did for this braita. How could you say it's in that case if the rabbis exempt? For what reason would they possibly exempt? To which they answer, Amrei man chachamim Rabbi Shimon, de'amar shrita she'ena ru'uya lo shma shrita. This we saw in the Mishna. Rabbi Shimon holds that if you do a shrita that's not a proper shrita, then you're not obligated. Okay, meaning when the Torah says tavach, you're going to be liable for slaughtering. It has to be a slaughtering that is kosher, meaning, right, a perfect slaughtering that you can then eat the meat. So bishlama, okay, now remember there were 3 cases, and now we're going to go through all 3 and see do they all work with this theory. So bishlama already means some are going to work and some are not. So let's go through the list. Bishlama, they're skipping the first case because that's the one that's not going to work. Bishlama avodah zarah v'shor niskal shchita she'ena ru'uya. Okay, if I slaughter an animal for the purposes of idol worship, that is forbidden to benefit from. So I obviously can't eat it. It's not a shrita kshera, which means it's not called tavach. So when the Torah says I'm liable for slaughtering, I'm not liable the penalty of the arba'ah chamisha for slaughtering something that I can't eat. And also shor niskal, same thing. Once this shor is determined to be a shor niskal and you're supposed to stone it, if you slaughter it, you can't eat the animal. It's forbidden to benefit from. So both those make perfect sense. Ela Shabbat, shchita ru'uyai. But Shabbat is a proper shchita. Why is it a proper shchita? Well, it's not. It says in the Mishna, "Hashochet b'Shabbat b'Yom Kippurim, af al pi shenitchayev b'nafsho, shchitato kshera." If you slaughter an animal on Shabbat or on Yom Kippur, even though you're liable the death penalty for doing this, the meat is actually kosher. You did a kosher shchita. It's kosher. You can eat it. So how are we going to explain the Mishnah then? Why the rabbis exempt you in the case of Shabbat? This is our big question. We're going to end up with 2 tracks of answering this question. Okay, I'll already tell you that in one track, we're going to basically say the rabbis didn't exempt in that case. They only exempted in case 2 and 3. When they said potrim, they weren't referring to this case. But first, we're going to explain it in a way that you can understand it, as he really exempts in all 3 cases. And we're going to get into something that there's a shiur of Alana Stein-Hain about this whole concept. It's a fascinating concept. We've learned it a few times already, which is why it's great to have Alana's shiur on it, in Din and Daf, about how we view malacha that was done on Shabbat, okay? Something you created on Shabbat in a forbidden way. We're going to have a 3-way machloket here, which is what the Gemara is going to say, even though there's a Mishnah that says you can eat it. Amrei savar laka Rabbi Yochanan asamlar. Says, because we can say, so now we have to say the rabbis held like Rabbi Yochanan asamlar on this issue. Let's see what he says. Ditnan. We're going to have 6 things because there's 3 opinions and there's shogeg and mezi. There's a difference between if you did it unwittingly or you did it intentionally, how we treat what you created on Shabbat. That's why it's a fascinating topic, and I recommend listening to Alana's shiur. Ditnan, hamevashel b'Shabbat b'shogeg yochal, b'mezi lo yochal divrei Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Meir, if you did it b'shgaga, unwittingly, you didn't realize it was Shabbat, let's say, or you didn't realize it was forbidden to cook in that way, so you can eat it. B'mezid, but if you did it intentionally, lo yochal, you can't eat it. Rabbi Yehuda omer b'shogeg yochal b'motzei Shabbat. Rabbi Yehuda says it's true you can eat it if you did it unwittingly, but after Shabbat is over. B'mezid lo yochal olamit. If you did it intentionally, you can't ever eat it. And this is how we paskin, by the way. Rabbi Yochanan Asandler omer b'shogeg yachel l'motzei Shabbat la'achirim v'lo lo. He starts to say, wait, if you did it b'shogeg, it can be eaten after Shabbat, but not you. The person who did it themselves is not allowed to eat it. Other people, they can eat it. B'mezid Lo yachel olamit lo lo v'lo lacherim. He has the most severe position, and that's what we're going to say here. Is the rabbis who exempt basically hold you're exempt because it's just like shor and iskal and shul shenishchat lavodah zarah, because all those are forbidden to benefit from for everybody. So this is not a kosher shlita. Even though, right, it was you did it in a kosher manner, it doesn't matter. It's not called the tavakta. You didn't tavach. You didn't slaughter this animal because it's not a slaughtering that anyone could ever eat, according to Rabbi Yochanan Sanlar. So we would have to say that the rabbis in that braita hold like Rabbi Yochanan Sanlar. So now we're going to just explain my Talmud Rabbi Yochanan Sanlar, and then we're going to raise one sort of issue about this saying that this is what the rabbis hold, and that's going to give us track 2, which is going to say the rabbis actually don't exempt in that case. So first we're going to see what's his reason. My Talmud Rabbi Yochanan Sanlar, Kididarish Rabbi Chia Pitra de Ben Nasi, as Rabbi Chia explained when he was in the entranceway of the house of the Nasi. Ushmartem et Shabbat ki kodesh yilachem. I'll read you the whole pasuk or the rest of that next section. I won't read you the whole pasuk, but the next section is mechalaleha mot yuma, because we're going to darshan that in a minute. So ushmartem et Shabbat, observe the Sabbath, ki kodesh yilachem, because it is sanctified for you. We're going to darshan the kodesh. We're going to darshan for you, and we're going to get to the words mechalaleha mot yuma. Those who desecrate it will be killed. So first, let's start out with the kodesh. Ma kodesh asur ba'achila, ma se Shabbat asuri ba'achila. So they learn from here, since kodesh, Shabbat is kodesh. What do we mean by Shabbat here? That's kodesh. We're going to say anything you create on Shabbat is like something that's sanctified. Something that's sanctified you can't eat. It's sanctified. It's not yours. So likewise, right? You can't benefit from them. Likewise, ma se Shabbat, something you create on Shabbat, you can't benefit from. So ima kodesh asur b'hana'ah, af ma se Shabbat asur b'hana'ah. But wait, if you can't, forget about, right, not only not eating, Rabbi Nachman didn't say you can't benefit from it. You could give it to your dog, let's say. Okay, so if you're going to say, as we learned out from Kodesh, well, Kodesh is forbidden also to benefit, not just to eat. So therefore, you might get to the conclusion, the Maaseh Shabbat, you also can't benefit from. Not only can you not eat, you also can't benefit. Talmud lomar lachem, because it says Kodesh he lachem. The Kodesh means you can't eat it. But you might have thought also you can't benefit, but then it says it's for you, meaning, well, you can benefit from it. Again, you have to assume the whole pasuk is talking about Maaseh Shabbat, not Shabbat itself, but things you create in a forbidden manner on Shabbat. Now, Yachol afilu b'shogeg. Well, why is Rabbi Yochanan Sanlar stricter in intentional? Maybe also if you didn't intend to do it, the same thing would still apply. Talmud lomar mechalaleha mot yuma, because the next words are those who desecrate it will die. Now, when do you die? Only if you did it intentionally, not if you did anything unintentionally. So b'mezid amarti l'chavalo b'shogeg. So we basically explained from all those words that you can't eat it, you can benefit, and it's only if it's unintentional, if it's intentional, not unintentional. That was just an aside to explain where Rabbi Yochanan Sanlar gets his opinion. But now we're going to have a big machloket about his opinion. We don't know who says what, but they have a machloket. One says Rabbi Yochanan Sanlar forbids something created on Shabbat on a Torah level. Some people think by Torah law it's actually permitted. Only the rabbis came and instituted, let's be more strict with you and not permit you to eat it. But, by Torah law, you could. So now we're going to have a big problem. So first, we're going to say what's the basis for their machlok. If you say it's by Torah law, well, we just darshaned it from the pasuk in the Torah. That's very simple. Manda amar de Rabbanan amar kra kodeshu hu kodesh ve'masav kodesh. Well, the one who says that it's rabbinic basically reads that pasuk is not talking about Maaseh Shabbat. That pasuk is talking about Shabbat itself. Shabbat itself is kodesh, not something you create on Shabbat. So that's how they explained that. But now we have a big problem, because what was our theory? Our theory was that the rabbis who exempt someone who slaughters on Shabbat is because they hold like Rabbi Shimon, that slaughtering that's not a kosher slaughtering is not considered a slaughter. And then tavach in the Torah, right, is not shchita, because it's a shchita that's not a valid shchita. So bishlam lamanda amar deoraita. So if you hold it by Torah law forbidden, well, that makes perfect sense. Turning now to amabet. Amtulahachi patre Rabbanan. That's why the rabbis exempted. Ela lamanda amar de Rabbanan, amai patre Rabbanan. But if you hold that it's only rabbinic, now what does it mean it's only rabbinic? It means the rabbis later came and said, if you cook something on Shabbat, you slaughter something on Shabbat, it's forbidden. Okay, but by Torah law, it's permitted. If it's permitted by Torah law, and the Torah forbids slaughtering an animal that you stole, and you're going to incur the 4 or 5 payment, and we say, oh, but a shchita she'ena ru'uya is not shchita, right? It's not called shchita if it's a shchita that you can't eat. But by Torah law, you actually can eat something you slaughtered on Shabbat. So then you wouldn't be able to say that that's the reason why the rabbi's exempt. So that's why I said we have 2 tracks to understanding this, why the rabbi's exempt. If Rabbi Yochanan Sandler thinks the Maaseh Shabbat is by Torah law forbidden, then it works perfectly. The rabbi's exempt in Shabbat for that reason, okay, because they exempt because you can't eat it, and therefore it's not called shchita, and therefore there's no 4 or 5 payment. Just like you can't eat the shor haniskal that you slaughtered, and you can't eat a shor that was slaughtered for avodah zarah, for idol worship. But if you say it's rabbinic, then you can't explain the Shabbat case in that way. So how are you going to explain it? To which the answer, as I already told you, ash'ara, avodah zarah, v'shor haniskal. His words, chachamim potrim, is only on the last 2 cases. Again, it's a little hard to read the braita that way. Why didn't it say so? But basically, we're going to say the only way to read that Mishnah is to basically isolate the case of Shabbat and say that even though it said 3 cases, Rabbi Meir obligates you, when it says the rabbis exempt you, they're really only talking about the second 2, because there's no other way to really explain it. Okay, so that was all about the braita. So we started with Rabbi Meir. We explained Rabbi Meir in the first line of the braita. Ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat. We explained the only way to explain that is to say toveach ha'yidei achel. Somebody else did it, and that's why there's no law of kimle. Otherwise, it would be a law of kimle, and that's how we explain our Mishnayot, all according to Rabbi Meir. First Mishnah exempts because there is no kimle, because there's no, right, because it's loke u'mishalem, you would get both. But the second Mishnah, the next Mishnah, which talks about slaughtering on Shabbat and other things which incur the death penalty, you're exempt because there is kimle in death. And then this braita, that's why Rabbi Meir makes you liable, because it's tovech ha'yidei acher. Why would the rabbis exempt then? And the answer is the rabbis exempt because of shchita is not anything that's not a proper shchita. There's a different reason, basically. It's because the rabbis here hold like Rabbi Shimon, shchita she'ena kshera ena korea shchita. That's not called shchita. So you're not liable to tabach u'machal if it's not a shchita that you can eat. And you'd have to say it, the Shabbat case holds like Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, or they may be obligated in Shabbat. That's basically what we've done until now. So that's our review of this section of the daf. Now what we didn't deal with is, why does Rabbi Meir obligate? We're back to the beginning. Why does of the braita, the dealing with the braita, why does he obligate in the case of ganav tabach lavodah zarah and ganav shor niskal v'tvacho? So now we're going to ask some questions about this. Rabbi Meir, my mechayev shochet lavodah zarah. There's a problem with this. Why? Kevan de shachat bapolta asra. Once you start, okay, shchita has 2 parts to it. There's the beginning. You have to slaughter. When you slaughter the animal, you do 2 simanim, the esophagus and the trachea. Now, when you don't do it all in the first second. So you first do one, then the other. So as soon as you start slaughtering for idol worship, it's already become forbidden to benefit from. And then idach isur hana'ahu. At that moment, it becomes forbidden to benefit, which means it doesn't really have an owner. It's worth nothing. Velo demare katavach. So when you finish the slaughtering, now we're going to learn this on tomorrow's daf, because the pasuk says utvacho, you're only obligated in slaughtering when you complete the shchita. So in the beginning of the shchita, it becomes ownerless because it's worth nothing, basically, because you can't benefit from it. You can't eat it. You can't benefit from it. Nothing. So it's basically worth nothing. So when you slaughter it, you're actually not slaughtering something that belongs to somebody else. How can you be obligated? To which I'm a Rava. Again, ukimta, you would have to say, it's a case, by the way, this has nothing to do with whether you slaughtered it yourself or you slaughtered al yeshaliach. It would be a question either which way, whether someone else did it for you or you did it yourself. It doesn't matter. But it would be that you had in mind, I'm going to offer this up to the idols when I finish slaughtering it. In other words, only at the end of the slaughtering. And that would have it all come at the same time, which would mean, again, nothing to do with kimle. This has to do with, it would have ownership until the very end. So it has to be owned by someone for me to be liable to pay the 4 or 5 payment. So that's what you would have to say to explain the avodah zarah case. Shor haniskal, isurei hana'aninu. Another problem with shor haniskal. Shor haniskal, okay, and you can't answer the same thing because shor haniskal is already forbidden to benefit from before I start slaughtering it. It's already called a shor haniskal. It was judged to be stoned. So it's already forbidden to benefit from. So what am I causing? I'm not causing any loss to the original owner. So why should I pay 4 or 5? It's worth nothing to the original owner. Lav demari katabach. Again, I'm slaughtering something that doesn't belong to the owner anymore. The words lav dide katabach shouldn't be here. Amar Rava, okay, this is a bit complicated. So I'll tell you a little bit outside first, just the first part of it. It's going to be premised on 2 different opinions of 2 different rabbis. So patience. If the case is not going to be as simple as we thought, okay, as we've already been learning, none of these cases are as simple as we thought. Instead of Ruth stealing from Naomi and slaughtering Naomi's animal, Naomi, or in this case, it would have to be right. Naomi would have a shor haniskal. Naomi's animal would have killed, right, a person, be convicted, and then Ruth stole it and slaughtered it. But that's not the case. The case is where Naomi first gave her animal, before it killed anybody, gave her animal to Tamar. And while the animal was in Tamar's possession, and she was watching it, she was a shomer, okay? So she's in charge, responsible for Naomi's animal, and has to return Naomi's animal in the end. And then everything transpired under Tamar, which means the animal, let's read it inside. So while Tamar was in charge of this animal, the animal went out and damaged and killed somebody, who was testified against while it was still in her possession. Nigmar dino bebeit hashomer. Okay, all this while she doesn't return the shore to the original owner. Then the ox gets convicted while Tamar is still in charge. And then it doesn't say so, but then Ruth steals the animal and slaughters it. All happening under Tamar's domain. Why is this important? Well, you would have to say that Rabbi Meir, who's the one who is obligating in this case, in the Shor Niskal case, would have to hold Savar like Rabbi Yaakov and Savar like Rabbi Shimon. He would have to hold both like Rabbi Yaakov and like Rabbi Shimon. Okay, we don't know who they are and what they say yet, so let's wait. Let's see. Savar like Rabbi Yaakov da'amal. Ach mishenigmar dino, and we learned this already. Hichziro shomer lebali muchzar. There's a big machloket. If Tamar is watching the shore, and the shore becomes a shor niskal under her jurisdiction while she's in charge, in the end, she has to return an ox to Naomi because she was watching it. Now, you would think that once the shore is worth nothing, because the shore is now going to get stoned, she can't return the animal. She has to return the value of the animal because it was her fault. It all happened when she was in charge. And that's what some of the rabbis say. But Rabbi Yaakov says, no, if the shore is intact, okay, since it's, if you remember, hezek she'eino nikar, the shore looks the same. The fact that the shore killed somebody, right, it doesn't make the shore look any different, right? I'm thinking of the picture of the portrait of Dorian Gray, right? Where he looked different after he started killing people, but the shore doesn't look any different. So the shore is allowed, you can just give him the shore and say, look, shore lakachti, right? Take my shore back. Okay, I took a shore from you, I'm giving you a shore back. Even though the shore theoretically is really worth nothing now and is going to get stoned. But according to Rabbi Yaakov, you can return them. That's step 1. Step 2 is you also have to hold like Rabbi Shimon, though, to say that again, if Ruth steals it from Tamar, she's going to have to be liable. Why? Even though the shore is worth nothing. Because Rabbi Shimon dami. Let's think of this situation. If Tamar can return the ox to Naomi as is, then even though it's forbidden to benefit from, the animal's worth 0, the animal actually has value. Because now that Ruth stole it and Tamar can't return the animal, Tamar now has to pay the value of the shore to Naomi, whereas she could have gotten away with not paying anything. So that's what we call, it's something that doesn't have inherent value, but it actually, by stealing it, it causes a monetary loss to someone. It does have monetary value to it because Tamar can pay, just give back the animal. And now that she doesn't have the animal, she's going to have to pay money out of pocket. Now, not everybody thinks that that's considered mamon, but Rabbi Shimon holds that if it's something that causes a monetary obligation, then it's considered like money. Ditnan, how do we know this? Because Rabbi Shimon says, Kodashim shechayav b'achrayutan chayav. Let's say I designate an animal for a sacrifice and you steal it from me. Now, I'm not the owner because it belongs to the temple, so you don't have to pay me back. But it depends. According to Rabbi Shimon, there's 2 kinds of ways that I could bring a voluntary sacrifice. I could say, behema zo alai. This animal is sanctified. If I do it in that way and you steal it, it doesn't matter because I don't have to, once I say the animal sanctified, it belongs to the temple, even though it's in my possession right now. And if something happens to the animal, I don't have to replace it and bring a different animal in its stead. But if I say hare alai, if I say it's obligatory on me to bring a sacrifice to the temple, and then I designate an animal, and then you steal it, I have to bring a different animal in its stead. So that's the exact same thing. If I'm chayav b'achrayutan, if I have to replace it, then you're chayav if you steal it from me, because it's davar gorem lamamon, because now I have to pay money out of pocket to buy a new animal. So that's causing me a monetary loss, and Rabbi Shimon views that as alma davar gorem lamamon kimamon dam. He says that counts as money. Last point about this Rabbi Meir thing and saying our Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir. So this explained, what we did right now is we finished explaining the braita. It took a very long time to explain that braita. We had to understand why the rabbi is exempt. Right? First, we had to understand why Rabbi Meir obligated in the Shabbos case. Then we had to explain why the rabbi is exempt in all three cases. Then we went back and explained why Rabbi Meir obligates in the second and the third case about the Shor Niskal and the Avodah Zarah. And now we're back to the beginning. If we assume our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir because lokeu mishalem, because of the Yom Kippur case, we have a problem because I'm Rav Kana, Marita l'shmate kamei de Rav Zvi min Nahardia. I told this to Rav Zvi from Nahardia, which by the way reminds me, I forgot to mention yesterday. Shuli Mishkan wrote a whole article on Nahardia yesterday because we had the whole thing about the Chachmei Nahardia. So we have it again today. So you could read up about Nahardia. You could print it out for Shabbat if you want. Mi matzit mukma manitin ka Rabbi Meir v'lo ka Rabbi Shimon. How can we say our Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir and not like Rabbi Shimon? Now, why not like Rabbi Shimon? Well, by saying it's Rabbi Meir, we said Rabbi Meir is the only Tana who holds lokeu mishalem. No other Tana does. Now, why are we mentioning Rabbi Shimon? Because Rabbi Shimon comes up at the end of our Mishnah. Now, what does Rabbi Shimon say? Haktani seifa. It could have been anyone really, but we're asking specifically about Rabbi Shimon because of this. It says in the end of the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon poter b'shnei elu. If you remember, there were 4 cases. Who can remember now? But at the end of the Mishnah, there were 4 cases. This is where we talked about Shemitah, she'ena ruya lo shma shchita in yesterday's stuff. If you slaughter it for medicinal purposes or to give to your dog, which is not for eating purposes, or nimtzei treifa, which means it's not a kosher shchita, or chulin ba'azara, which also now you can't benefit from, you can't eat it all because it's forbidden to benefit. Mishalem tashlumei arba v'chamisha. You anyway pay arba v'chamisha, even though you can't eat this animal. Rabbi Shimon poter b'shnei elu. He disagrees about the last 2 and exempts, which makes it sound like what? Because it says at the end, he's poter b'shnei elu michlal, it sounds like that's the only part of the Mishnah he disagrees with, right? Which means michlal, there would be kula manitim modeh. He must agree with the whole rest of the Mishnah. Now, we can't possibly agree with the whole rest of the Mishnah. If we say the whole Yom Kippur thing is because lokeu mishalem, Rabbi Meir is the only one who holds that way. Rabbi Shimon, we assume, doesn't hold like Rabbi Meir on that issue because it doesn't say anywhere else. He's the only one mentioned with that opinion. To which they say, Amar lo, don't you infer the wrong thing from the Rabbi Shimon. When he says, only b'shnei elu in those 2, what he meant to say is demodeh b'tavach lerefuah u'leklavim. He says, I agree with case number 1 and 2 of the dog and the medicinal purposes. I disagree with you about the last 2 about the shchita, right? The 2 that really you can't ever eat because they're not kosher shchita. But he wasn't relating it all to the rest of the Mishnah. Okay, so that's a way we can explain that. That was just a side question that we resolved. Now we get to a new sugya, which we'll continue into tomorrow. First, they're quoting the words in the Mishnah. You remember, if you steal from your father, you sell it or slaughter it, and then you end up incurring the payment of arba v'chamisha. Even though your father dies after the slaughtering, you still have to pay arba v'chamisha. But if you slaughtered it after the father's death and you're already a partial heir of it, then you're not liable. Okay, we'll get to that case tomorrow, but just know that exists because we're going to mention it a little today. So Rava asked Rav Nachman a question not relating to this, but they're going to bring this in as a difficulty on the answer that Rav Nachman brings. If you steal a shore that belonged to 2 people, jointly owned, and then you admitted to one of them that you stole from them, and you slaughtered it. Once you admit to one of them, what happens? Modeh b'knas patur. The 4 or 5 is only a knas; it's a penalty. Which means that if you admit it, you're not obligated, but you only admitted to one of them. So you're not obligated to pay the 4 or 5 to that one owner, but it's half owned by somebody else. Do you have to pay the half of arba v'chamisha to the other? Chamisha bakar amar Rav Nachman, do we say? It says 5 bakar, v'lo chamisha chatzei bakar. It doesn't ever mention that you could pay half payments of sheep, of cattle. Or maybe it says 5, but yeah, it could also be half of 5 if that were to be the case. So which way does it go? Amar le, Rav Nachman answers, only if it's a full, complete payment, you wouldn't have to pay in this case. Okay, the very end of today's talk, we're going to see Rav Nachman changes his mind and says the opposite, but right now, this is what he said. Eitive, so Rava questions him from our Mishna. Ganav mishal aviv tabachu machar b'achar kach meit aviv. Mishalem tashlumei arba v'chamisha. Now, who does he pay it to? He pays to the brothers, but he's also an heir of the father. So this is also a case where he's actually only going to make a partial payment, because let's say he has one brother, so half of it belongs to him and half of it to the brother. So he's not going to pay half because it's his own, because he inherited it. So ha'hacha kevan demeit aviv. So since his father died and he's a part owner now, and he only pays half, it's just like the case of admitting to one, where he's exempt from half the payment. Vikatani, what does it say in our Mishnah? It says you pay. So that seems to be difficult. Amar le says to him, no, it must be where the father already, when the father was alive, the son stood in judgment for stealing from his father and already was obligated the 4 or 5 and just didn't get around to paying it yet. And then the father died. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute, if that's a distinction, then if our Mishnah sets up in this case, you're liable, in the next case, you're not liable, it should have said that in the next case. It should have said it in the next Mishnah, right? So that's basically what they're going to say. Now, if you think that if he wasn't convicted before the father died, in the next Mishnah, it says only if he slaughters it after the death of the father. But if the case is, even if he wasn't convicted yet in court, then since it says in the next Mishnah, Ganav mishal aviv mate, and then Tavachu Machal Eno Mashalem Tashlomer Rabba Chamisha after the father's death. Niflo Bedide, it should have said there, Bamed Barim Amuling Shama Bedin. When are you obligated if you were judged already, convicted? Avalo Ama Bedin, but if you didn't stand up in court yet, Eno Mashalem Tashlomer Rabba Chamisha. So why didn't it say that if that's the distinction? To which they say, Amalei Achinami. Now you can assume that's still the distinction. It just didn't say it for technical reasons. I did Nasib Resha Ganam Mishal Aviv Tamachu Achar Bachar Kach Meit Aviv. Nasib Seifanami Ganam Mishal Aviv Meit Aviv Achar Kach Tabachu Machal. Basically, they're saying the Mishnayot were set up in a very parallel way. So this one said this, it didn't mention Hamad Abedin, so the other one didn't mention it either. But theoretically, you could still make that distinction. And then we're going to say, okay, but let's Safra Amar, but in the morning, he said Chamisha Bakar Amar Rahmana Vafilu Chamisha Chatzei Bakar. But then he changes his mind, and then the Gemara is going to say, what made him change his mind? Okay, that's for tomorrow. So quick review of our daf. We started with Ganav v'tavach b'Yom Kippurim. We said it must be Rabbi Meir. Then we said, right, but because Lokel Mishalem, what about Meir Mishalem? And then we said, no, he obviously doesn't know Meir Mishalem. Well, what do we do with that braita then? And then we had to explain the braita, and then we had to explain the rabbis in the braita. And with that, we got into all sorts of interesting topics like Maaseh Shabbat, which I said you can listen to Alana Steinhain Shiur about it, get more information. You can also we have this fascinating topic of shliach l'dvar v'ra, but yet in this case there is shliach l'dvar v'ra. This is an exception to the rule. Also fascinating sugya. And then we got to we finished, then why did Rabbi Meir obligate in Avodah Zarah case and in the Shor Niskal case? And then we went to this other topic entirely of could there be a partial payment if you admitted to one partner and you still owe to the other partner? Is there such a thing as a half payment? Which right now we said no. But tomorrow we'll see how Rav Nachman changes his mind and says, actually, you would pay a partial payment. With that, we finish for today. Just so you know, the Shabbat daf is very short. It's half an hour. So that'll incentivize you to get it done quicker. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov. Let's hope for better news in the coming days.